Hello, everyone. Today we're diving into a chilling episode where a child disappears for hours with no cameras, no plates, no proof, and the only message her mother receives is, "She's just out playing." But the next line changes everything. "If you don't listen next time, she'll play longer." So, who's pulling the strings, and what will Diep choose when love comes with a price? The afternoon light over the city looks normal. That's the cruel part. Diep stands in the kitchen, rinsing a cup that doesn't really need to be rinsed, listening to the clock tick like it's counting down to something she can't see yet. Outside the window, traffic flows. People laugh. Someone's radio plays a soft song from a passing motorbike. Her phone is on the counter, screen dark. Nhi should be home by now. Diep checks the time again, then again, trying to talk herself into calm. Maybe Nhi stopped to look at something. Maybe the teacher held her for a minute. Maybe the bus was late. But the feeling in Diep's chest doesn't match those explanations. It tightens, like a hand slowly closing. She calls the school. Her voice is polite, controlled. A mother trying not to panic in front of strangers. "Hi, this is Diep. I'm calling about Nhi. She usually arrives home by now." There's a pause on the other end. Papers shifting. A chair scraping. Then the receptionist says something that makes the room tilt. "Oh, Nhi was picked up." Diep goes still. Picked up? By who? The woman's voice tries to stay calm, like she's answering something normal. "Someone came to pick her up this afternoon. She left with them." Diep's fingers grip the phone so hard her knuckles turn pale. "Who was it?" she asks, slower now. "A relative? A guardian? Did you check?" Another pause. This one longer. "We don't know," the woman admits. There were no cameras at the gate. No license plates recorded, no clear signs of wrongdoing. It looked ordinary. Ordinary. Diep almost laughs, but nothing comes out. Her throat tightens. Her eyes burn. "So you let her go," Diep whispers. The woman rushes in, defensive, but not cruel. "Ma'am, Nhi didn't look scared. She didn't scream. There was no struggle. She simply walked out." Diep's stomach drops, because she understands what that means. Whoever took Nhi knew how to make it look clean. Whoever took Nhi knew how to make it look like nothing happened. Diep ends the call with shaking hands, then stands in the kitchen like her body has forgotten what to do next. She tries to breathe. One breath. Two. But panic doesn't leave politely. It floods. She grabs her keys and rushes outside, half running down the stairs, hair falling loose, heart banging against her ribs like it's trying to escape first. On the street, she calls again and again. No answer. She texts Nhi's little tablet. Nothing. Diep's mind becomes a storm of images. Nhi's backpack, Nhi's small hand, Nhi calling Uncle James with that bright trust. Diep whispers to herself, "Please, please, please." Then, hours later, her phone buzzes. Unknown number. Diep freezes so suddenly she almost drops it. The message is short, casual, as if it's a friend letting her know they're running late. She's just out playing. Diep's chest lifts in a sharp inhale, relief trying to enter, but it stops dead when the next line arrives. "But if you don't listen, next time she'll play longer." Diep's hands turn cold. Her eyes dart around the street, searching faces, windows, reflections, anything that might show her who's watching. The city keeps moving like nothing has changed. That's the point. This isn't a violent display. It's power, quiet and precise. A man proving he can touch what she loves most, whenever he wants. Diep types back with trembling fingers. "Where is she?" No response. She tries again. "Please, tell me she's safe." Still nothing. Minutes stretch like hours. Then a final buzz. A location pin. A public park. A place full of people. A place where the child can be returned without anyone noticing the terror that came before. Diep arrives breathless, scanning benches and swings, eyes wild. And then she sees her. Nhi sits on a low wall near a vendor cart, legs swinging, licking a small ice cream like it's a normal day. Her hair is a little messy. Her backpack is still on. And Diep's knees almost give out. She rushes forward and pulls Nhi into her arms so tightly Nhi squeaks. "Mom?" Nhi says, confused. Why are you crying?" Diep shakes her head, trying to smile through the ache. "I just missed you," she whispers. Nhi's small arms wrap around her neck. "Auntie said I could play," Nhi says. Diep's blood turns to ice. "What, Auntie?" Nhi points vaguely. "She was over there. She bought me ice cream." "She said you were busy." Diep looks, sees only strangers. No auntie, no trace, just a crowd that could hide anyone. Diep lifts Nhi's face gently and checks her. No bruises, no cuts, no fear, only innocence. And that innocence makes Diep feel even more helpless. Back home, Diep locks the door twice. She keeps Nhi close, like distance itself is dangerous now. That night, she doesn't sleep. She sits beside Nhi's bed, listening to every tiny sound from the hallway. And when her phone buzzes again, Diep nearly stops breathing. Unknown number. Another message. Good. Just that. One word. Like someone is grading her obedience. Diep turns the phone face down and presses both palms to her mouth to keep herself from making a sound. Because if she breaks, she's afraid the world will hear it. The next morning, something else begins. Not with a text, with whispers. Diep walks Nhi to school, and she feels eyes on her, longer than usual, heavier than curiosity. At the corner cafe, two women stop talking when she enters. At the market, a vendor who normally smiles suddenly looks away. Diep tells herself she's imagining it. But then her neighbor, Mrs. Lan, leans in with a tight expression. "Diep," she says softly. "Are you okay?" Diep forces a polite smile. "Why?" Mrs. Lan hesitates. "People are saying things." Diep's smile falters. "Saying what?" Mrs. Lan's voice drops even lower. "That you were involved in some scam in the past. That you tricked people. That you take advantage." Diep goes cold. She doesn't even ask how the rumor started. She already knows. This is how isolation works. Not a loud attack, just a slow turning of the community's face away from you. Until you're alone. Diep walks home with Nhi's hand in hers, smiling at people who don't smile back. Her world shrinks by inches. And then, in the afternoon, her phone buzzes again. Unknown number. Diep's heart stutters. The message is longer this time, cold, clear, final. "Leave Jame. She will be safe. You stay. I don't promise anything." Diep's vision blurs. She stares at the screen until the words stop looking like words and start feeling like a cliff edge. Across the room, Nhi hums softly while coloring, unaware she's become someone's leverage. Diep's hands tremble, and at that exact moment, her front door opens. Jame steps in, tired eyes, coat still on, carrying groceries like he's trying to build normal life out of small routines. He pauses the second he sees her face. "Diep?" he says gently. "What's wrong?" Diep forces her shoulders back. "Nothing." James doesn't move. His gaze sharpens, not angry, just focused. "You've been sad for days," he says. Quiet, distant. You're smiling, but it's not reaching your eyes. Diep swallows hard. James steps closer, lowering his voice so Nhi won't hear. "Talk to me," he says. "Please." Diep looks at him, this man who would fight the whole world for her, and realizes the truth could make the world fight back even harder. Her lips part. No sound comes out. James's eyes search hers, patient but relentless, and Diep feels herself caught between two choices she never asked for: love or Nhi's safety. James set the grocery bag down without a sound. Diep was still holding her phone like it weighed 100 pounds. Her face was too pale, her eyes too fixed, like she was trying not to fall apart in front of Nhi. James stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Diep, look at me." Diep blinked fast. "I'm fine." "You're not," James said, calm but firm. "What happened?" Across the room, Nhi colored quietly, humming to herself. A peaceful sound that made the air feel cruel. Diep swallowed. Her fingers tightened around the phone until her hand shook. "Tell me," James pressed, softer now. "Whatever it is, we handle it together." Diep's throat closed. She wanted to say it. She wanted to pour everything out, but she saw the message again in her mind. Cold and final. "Leave Jame. She will be safe. You stay. I don't promise anything." Diep forced a smile that didn't belong to her. "It's just people talking. Rumors." James's eyes narrowed. "What rumors?" Diep looked away. "It doesn't matter." James took a breath, controlling the rising edge in his chest. "It matters because it's you. Because you're scared." Diep shook her head quickly. "I'm not scared." James didn't argue. He only watched her, long enough that she felt exposed. Then Nhi looked up. "Uncle James, are you mad?" James's face softened instantly. He crouched beside her and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "No, sweetheart. I'm just tired." Nhi nodded, satisfied. She went back to coloring. James stood again and turned toward Diep, his voice low. "Let's go to the kitchen." Diep followed, slow and stiff, like every step was a decision. In the kitchen, James kept his tone gentle. "Start from the beginning." Diep stared at the countertop. "Nhi didn't come home on time yesterday." James went still. "What?" Diep's voice trembled. "The school said someone picked her up. They said there were no cameras, no license plates, nothing. Like it was normal." James's jaw tightened. "And a few hours later," Diep continued, "I got a message. They said she was just out playing. But if I don't listen, next time she'll play longer." James's face drained of color. Diep finally looked up, eyes wet but trying to stay strong. "They brought her back. She was fine, but that's the point." James's hands curled into fists at his sides. "Who did this?" Diep didn't answer. She didn't have to. James exhaled slowly. "My father." Diep flinched. "James, please." James lifted a hand. "He didn't kidnap her," he said, forcing the word to stay quiet. "He made her disappear just long enough to prove he can." Diep nodded, tears slipping now. "Then today, people started looking at me differently." James's eyes sharpened. "Why?" "They're spreading rumors," Diep whispered. "That I was part of a scam before, that I trick people, that I'm dangerous." James's mouth hardened. "He's isolating you." Diep's phone buzzed in her pocket like a heartbeat. She froze. James saw it. "Show me." Diep hesitated, then pulled the phone out and turned the screen toward him. James read the message once. Twice. His breathing changed. "Leave Jame. She will be safe. You stay. I don't promise anything." James went terrifyingly still. Then his voice dropped into a calm that sounded like steel. "He's using Nhi as leverage." Diep grabbed James's wrist. "Don't! Go to him!" she pleaded. "If you confront him, he'll do worse." James looked at her hand on his arm, then back to her eyes. "Then we don't confront. We move smart. Diep shook her head. I don't want you to fight your father because of me. James's expression softened for half a second. This isn't because of you. This is because he crossed a line. Diep's voice cracked. But if I leave you, Nhi is safe. James leaned closer. And if you leave me, what happens after? He'll know it worked. Next time, he'll demand more. Diep's lips trembled. She had no answer. James took her hands gently, grounding her. Listen, you don't choose between love and her safety. We protect both. Diep whispered. How? James spoke quietly, like he was laying down steps in the dark. First, he said, Nhi doesn't go anywhere alone. School pickup changes. We pick her up ourselves or with someone trusted. Diep nodded, shaking. Second, James continued, we change routines. No predictable paths. No predictable times. Okay, Diep breathed. Third, James said, we don't let the rumors trap you. We stay visible with the right people, teachers, neighbors who still trust you, anyone who can confirm the truth. Diep wiped her cheek. They won't believe me. James's eyes held hers. Then we make them believe with consistency, with calm, with evidence. Diep swallowed. And your father? James's jaw tightened again. I'll handle him, but not with rage. Diep gripped his hands harder. Promise me you won't destroy yourself. James nodded. I promise. But his eyes said something else. He wouldn't surrender. From the living room, Nhi called out, Uncle James, look, I drew a flower. James forced a smile and walked out, taking the paper with both hands as if it was precious. It's beautiful, he told her. You're getting so good. Nhi beamed. Diep watched from the doorway, feeling her chest twist. Because the flower on that page was bright and simple. Everything their lives weren't. Right now. That night, James stayed. He didn't leave her alone with the fear. He checked the locks twice. He kept the lights low. He sat near the window for a long time, staring out like he was measuring shadows. Diep lay beside Nhi, one arm wrapped around her, listening to every sound. Around midnight, James's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen and his face tightened. Diep whispered, Who is it? James didn't answer. He turned the phone so she could see. Unknown number. One line. Good girl. Diep's breath caught. He's watching. James nodded slowly. He wants you to feel that you're never alone. Diep's voice shook. What do we do? James's eyes stayed steady. We stop reacting like prey. He stood, grabbed his coat, then stopped himself. On purpose. No rushing. No storming out. He turned back to Diep. Tomorrow, I'm going to meet John again. Quietly. I want everything connected to my father's past. Every contract. Every enemy. Every secret. Diep whispered. Why? James answered without blinking. Because his fear came from somewhere. And if there's an old wound he's hiding behind, we'll find it. Diep stared at him. And if finding it makes him worse? James's voice dropped. Then we'll already be prepared. Diep looked down at Nhi sleeping, then back at James. If he can make her disappear once? James leaned in, voice gentle, but absolute. He won't do it again. Outside, the city slept. Inside that apartment, no one did. Diep lay still, trapped between two truths. She loved James, and someone had proven they could reach her child whenever they wanted. In the dark, James watched the window, his mind building a plan. Soft, but strong. And somewhere else, Mr. Hoan was likely smiling at the silence he'd created, convinced the world always chose fear. But The next part of this story wouldn't be decided by fear alone. Not anymore.
Chiều hôm đó, Nhi không về đúng giờ. Khi Diệp gọi đến trường, họ nói có người đến đón, nhưng không có camera, không biển số, không dấu hiệu bất thường. Vài giờ sau, Diệp nhận tin nhắn từ số lạ. Con bé chỉ đi chơi thôi, nhưng nếu cô không nghe, lần sau nó sẽ đi chơi lâu hơn. Nhi được trả lại an toàn ở nơi công cộng, nhưng Diệp hiểu đây là màn thị uy. Mr. Hoàng chứng minh rằng ông có thể chạm vào điều cô yêu nhất bất kỳ lúc nào. Ngay sau đó, người ta bắt đầu nhìn Diệp khác đi và tin đồn của từng dính vào lừa đảo, khiến cô bị cô lập. Cuối cùng, Diệp nhận tối hộp thư, rời Jame, nó sẽ an toàn. Jame thấy Diệp suy sụp và ép cô nói thật.